Pause for just a second. Really pause. Now look down at your hands, your arms, whatever skin you can see right now. The particular shade staring back at you, whether it's porcelain white, caramel brown, deep umber, or somewhere in the vast spectrum between, is telling an incredible story. A story written in your DNA about climates your ancestors endured, challenges they overcame, and evolutionary pressures that literally rewrote their genetic code. Here's something that might genuinely astonish you. If you're looking at pale skin right now, you're witnessing one of the newest adaptations in all of human evolution. I'm not exaggerating. This trait is younger than the pyramids, younger than written language, younger than the wheel. In the sweeping epic of human existence, light-colored skin appeared just moments ago. Every single person on Earth today, all 8 billion of us, can trace our lineage back to African ancestors who lived approximately 200,000 years ago. And here's the crucial part. Every one of those ancient humans had dark pigmentation. Deep brown, melanin-dense skin specifically evolved for withstanding intense tropical sunlight. That was humanity's original setting, the default, the starting point from which everything else branched. So what happened? How did humans end up looking so dramatically different from one another? Why do Norwegians look nothing like Kenyans when we're the same species, sharing the same African origin story? The answer isn't what you might assume. This isn't about separate human races evolving in isolation for millions of years. This isn't about fundamental biological differences between groups. This is about something far more fascinating: desperate adaptation to brutal new environments, the human body's remarkable plasticity, and genetic changes so rapid they transformed entire populations in just a handful of millennia. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly the intention here. Consider subscribing and dropping a comment about where you are and what time it is. I find it amazing seeing comments from listeners in Mumbai at midnight, Paris at dawn, Buenos Aires at dusk, all experiencing this same story simultaneously. This is fundamentally a migration story, a story about humans abandoning the warmth of Africa and pushing into frigid dark territories where sunlight became scarce, places that should have proven lethal. And in many ways, those places were lethal, until human biology adapted. Until random mutations, entirely accidental, gave certain individuals an advantage so powerful that within several thousand years, whole populations had transformed. The science of skin color proves far more complex and captivating than anyone understood until recently. This isn't about one gene or one simple switch. This involves multiple genetic mutations occurring in separate populations at different moments, all solving identical problems through slightly different mechanisms. This is about vitamin D and folate, about skeletal deformities and reproductive failure, about mothers fighting to keep infants alive through merciless northern winters. And here's what makes this narrative perfect for drifting into sleep. It's unhurried. Evolution never rushes. We're going to drift slowly through 60,000 years of human history, tracking our ancestors as they dispersed across continents, observing their skin gradually lighten in response to changing sunlight conditions. We'll encounter the specific genetic mutations that made pale skin possible. We'll explore why certain populations developed light skin while others didn't, despite living at similar latitudes. We'll uncover the surprising role agriculture played in accelerating these transformations. Most importantly, we'll understand what skin color actually signifies and what it doesn't. Because here's what modern genetics has proven beyond doubt: the visible physical differences between human populations, the differences that have fueled centuries of discrimination and conflict, represent an infinitesimally small fraction of our genetic blueprint. We're discussing maybe a couple dozen genes out of roughly 20,000. The overwhelming majority of human genetic diversity exists within populations, not between them. But tonight, we're not here for sociology or politics. We're here for the the genuine scientific, archaeological, genetic story of how humans became white. It's a detective story encoded in DNA, pieced together by researchers over decades of painstaking investigation, and it's far more intriguing than any oversimplified version you've encountered before. So settle in. Let your shoulders drop. Allow your breathing to deepen. We're about to journey back to when all humans were dark-skinned and trace the path that led some of them to transform into something unprecedented. A journey of survival, adaptation, and the extraordinary flexibility of human biology, the mystery encoded in your skin is about to unfold. Before anyone was pale, before anyone was light-skinned, before skin color became something humans even contemplated, we were all dark. Every single one of us. Your lineage, my lineage, everyone's lineage. Approximately 300,000 years ago in the sun-scorched landscapes of Africa, anatomically modern humans emerged, and they shared one universal characteristic: dark brown skin saturated with melanin, perfectly calibrated for the environment that shaped them. This wasn't random chance. Evolution doesn't gamble when survival hangs in the balance. Dark skin was the solution to a specific lethal problem: the African sun. Envision the world your earliest ancestors inhabited. Not contemporary Africa, though portions remain similar, but the Africa of the Middle Pleistocene. Endless grasslands stretching toward distant horizons, interrupted by scattered acacia trees and rocky outcroppings. The equatorial sun hammering down with an intensity that's difficult to comprehend if you've never experienced it directly. At midday, shade essentially vanishes. The sun sits directly overhead, and ultraviolet radiation cascades downward like invisible fire. This is where humans evolved, not in dense forests where thick canopies filter sunlight, not in temperate regions where clouds provide regular relief, but in the exposed savannas of equatorial Africa, where our ancestors had descended from the trees and were learning to walk upright across unprotected grasslands. That upright posture changed everything. When our ape ancestors moved on all fours, most of their body surface remained shaded by their own torso. The sun struck mainly their backs, and thick body hair provided additional protection. But when our ancestors stood upright and lost most body hair, probably to enhance cooling through sweating, they exposed enormous amounts of bare skin directly to solar radiation. This created a biological crisis. UV radiation isn't merely uncomfortable, it's destructive at the molecular level. It shatters chemical bonds. It damages DNA. Most critically for our ancestors, it destroys folate, a B vitamin absolutely essential for human survival. Folate performs something remarkable. It protects DNA during cell division, especially during the rapid cellular multiplication that occurs when embryos develop. Without adequate folate, neural tubes don't close correctly. Spinal columns don't form properly. Pregnancies fail catastrophically. Even in adults, folate deficiency triggers anemia, profound weakness, the inability to heal wounds effectively. In the unforgiving environment of prehistoric Africa, folate deficiency meant death. The African sun annihilates folate. Research demonstrates that just a few hours of intense UV exposure can degrade folate levels in the bloodstream by more than 50%. Now imagine you're an early human spending 12 hours daily outdoors, hunting, gathering, traveling between water sources. Without protection, your folate reserves would be constantly depleted. Enter melanin, nature's perfect sunscreen. Melanin is a pigment manufactured by specialized cells called melanocytes in the deepest layer of skin. It exists in different forms, but the most important for UV protection is eumelanin, the brown-black pigment that gives skin its darker tones. Eumelanin functions like billions of microscopic umbrellas distributed throughout your skin, absorbing and dispersing UV radiation before it can penetrate to deeper layers where blood vessels and DNA-rich cells reside. The more melanin you possess, the greater your protection. Dark brown skin can absorb and neutralize UV radiation dozens of times more effectively than pale skin. It's not perfect, nothing in evolution is, but it's remarkably efficient. Efficient enough that early humans with darker pigmentation could spend entire days beneath the African sun without suffering folate depletion. This wasn't merely advantageous, it was mandatory for survival. In the environment where humans evolved, dark skin represented the difference between successful reproduction and genetic extinction. Women with insufficient melanin experienced higher rates of pregnancy failure and birth defects. Children with pale skin were more vulnerable to sunburn, skin damage, and the long-term consequences of UV exposure. Adults suffered folate deficiency and its cascade of devastating health problems. Natural selection doesn't compromise when confronting problems this fundamental. Any genetic variation that increased melanin production would spread through the population rapidly. Within just a few thousand generations, essentially nothing in evolutionary time, all humans living in equatorial Africa possessed dark skin, and they all did. Every single anatomically modern human who lived in Africa before the Great Migrations had dark brown skin. The genetic evidence is unambiguous. The variations in genes controlling melanin production, the mutations that would later create lighter skin, didn't exist yet. Or, if they existed as random mutations, they were ruthlessly eliminated because they reduced fitness in the African environment. Consider what this means. For the first 240,000 years of modern human existence, possibly longer, skin color wasn't variable. It wasn't a marker distinguishing different populations or groups. Every human who looked at another human saw someone whose skin was roughly the same shade as their own. Dark skin wasn't a trait requiring explanation. It was simply what humans looked like. Life in those early African populations was harsh, but manageable. Your ancestors weren't struggling against their environment. They were adapted to it. They could hunt during the scorching midday heat without suffering sun damage. They could gather plant foods in exposed areas without worrying about UV radiation destroying essential nutrients in their bodies. Women could carry pregnancy successfully, producing healthy children with properly formed nervous systems. The archaeological evidence from this period shows humans thriving, not just surviving, but developing increasingly sophisticated technologies and social structures. They were crafting specialized tools, hunting large game, gathering diverse plant resources. They were creating art, at least by 100,000 years ago, probably earlier. They were developing the complex social networks that would eventually enable them to spread across the entire planet. And through all of this, through all these advances in technology and culture, their skin remained consistently dark. Because in Africa, under that intense equatorial sun, dark skin was simply what worked. But skin color accomplishes more than just protecting folate. It's a delicate balancing act, a compromise between competing biological needs, because while UV radiation is dangerous, it's also essential. Humans need sunlight to manufacture vitamin D, a crucial nutrient for bone development, immune function, and dozens of other physiological processes. UV radiation striking skin triggers a chemical reaction that synthesizes vitamin D. In equatorial Africa, this was never problematic. The sun is so intense that even heavily pigmented skin produces adequate vitamin D. Your dark-skinned ancestors obtained all the vitamin D they needed despite the UV-blocking properties of their melanin. The sun was powerful enough to penetrate even nature's best sunscreen. This is the crucial point. In the environment where humans evolved, dark skin represented the optimal balance. Maximum protection from UV damage, yet still sufficient UV penetration to maintain vitamin D production. It was the Goldilocks solution, not too much UV getting through, not too little, just right. Your earliest ancestors didn't contemplate any of this, naturally. They didn't understand melanin or folate or vitamin D. They simply lived under the African sun, generation after generation, shaped by forces they couldn't perceive or comprehend. But those forces were real, and they were powerful. They wrote the first chapter of human skin color in dark brown pigment. Then, around 70,000 years ago, some of those dark-skinned Africans did something unprecedented. They left. Small groups, probably just a few hundred individuals initially, crossed from Africa into the Arabian Peninsula and beyond. They carried with them all the genetic and cultural adaptations that had made them successful in Africa, including their dark skin. They didn't realize it yet, but they were carrying an adaptation that was perfect for Africa and increasingly problematic for everywhere else they were about to venture. The story of how human skin color diversified, how some populations became pale while others remained dark, begins with this migration, with dark-skinned people walking into environments where darkness itself would become a liability. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, rest in this knowledge. The deepest, oldest human adaptation, the one we all carried for hundreds of thousands of years, was dark skin. Rich, melanin-saturated, sun-adapted, dark brown skin. Before we were anything else, before we were diverse, before we were scattered across the world, we were all dark, all children of the African sun, all carrying the same protective pigment our ancestors needed to survive in the place where humanity was born. That darkness isn't a variation or deviation. It's the original human condition, the baseline from which everything else emerged. And in its own way, that's beautiful. We all start from the same place, painted in the same shades, protected by the same molecular shields. Our earliest ancestors evolved beneath the oldest human skies. Why would anyone leave Africa, where humans had lived successfully for hundreds of thousands of years? Where the climate was familiar, where people understood which plants were edible and which animals were dangerous. The honest answer is, we don't know with certainty. But we can make educated hypotheses based on what we understand about human behavior and environmental conditions at the time. First, the climate was changing. Not catastrophically like during earlier bottleneck events, but significantly enough to matter. Africa was experiencing cycles of expansion and contraction in habitable zones. During wet periods, the Sahara would transform into grassland paradise filled with lakes and rivers. During dry periods, it would contract back into the desert we recognize today. These cycles created a kind of pump effect. When conditions improved, populations would expand northward. When conditions deteriorated, they'd contract southward, but not always completely. Some groups would become stranded in refuges along the edges. Some would discover ways to keep moving forward rather than retreating. And some would find that the lands beyond Africa, while different, were also habitable. Second, human populations were growing. By 70,000 years ago, Africa probably supported hundreds of thousands of people, perhaps more. That might not sound substantial compared to today's billions, but for hunter-gatherers who required large territories to support each band, it was becoming crowded. Competition for prime hunting grounds and gathering areas was intensifying. Young groups, especially young men seeking to establish their own territories and families, would have felt the pressure. Moving into unexplored lands might have seemed less risky than fighting for increasingly contested resources at home. Third, humans had become exceptionally skilled at adapting to new environments. The descendants of earlier survivors had been refining their survival capabilities for hundreds of thousands of years. They knew how to interpret landscapes, identify novel food sources, develop innovative hunting strategies. The unknown wasn't as terrifying to them as it might have been to their ancestors. They possessed the tools, both physical and cognitive, to accept the challenge. And fourth, there's something in human nature that simply wants to discover what lies beyond the next hill. Call it curiosity, call it restlessness, call it the explorer's instinct, whatever you label it. It's a fundamental component of what makes us human. Some individuals in every generation feel the pull to move, to discover, to push boundaries. When those individuals started walking north out of Africa, they altered the course of human history forever. The initial migration probably wasn't dramatic. Nobody awoke one morning and decided to permanently abandon Africa. It was gradual, generation by generation, groups moving slightly further north, establishing seasonal camps that became permanent settlements, discovering new territories, and choosing to stay. The first exit route was probably through the Middle East. During favorable climate periods, the Arabian Peninsula wasn't the harsh desert it is today. It was grassland dotted with lakes and crossed by rivers. Archaeological sites from this period demonstrate that humans were following these water sources, tracking herds of large mammals that grazed along fertile corridors. Some groups traveled along coastlines, following the shoreline of the Red Sea and then around the Arabian Peninsula. This coastal route offered enormous advantages. Seafood provided reliable protein even when land animals were scarce. Coastal environments were less subject to extreme seasonal variations that made inland areas challenging, and the coast itself served as a natural navigation tool. Just keep the water on your left and keep walking. You can't get lost. These coastal migrants became specialists in a new kind of resource exploitation. They learned to read tides, identify edible shellfish, catch fish in shallow waters. Archaeological sites along ancient coastlines, now submerged by rising sea levels, show evidence of sophisticated seafood processing. These weren't desperate refugees surviving on whatever they could find. These were skilled specialists developing new technologies and new cuisines. They were innovating, adapting, thriving in environments their ancestors had never known. Other groups moved inland, following river valleys into the heart of Asia. The route along the Persian Gulf, up the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, into Mesopotamia and beyond, became a major highway for human migration. These river valleys were oases of fertility in otherwise challenging landscapes, providing water, game, edible plants, and natural pathways through mountains and deserts that would have been impassable otherwise. But here's where the story gets interesting. These migrants were walking into a world that already had people in it. Neanderthals and Denisovans, descendants of earlier human populations that had left Africa hundreds of thousands of years earlier, were still around, still thriving in Europe and Asia. The archaeological record shows that modern humans and Neanderthals coexisted in the Middle East for thousands of years, not necessarily peacefully, not necessarily as enemies, but definitely interacting. We know they interbred because modern humans of European and Asian descent carry Neanderthal DNA. Those genetic encounters probably represented everything from violent conflict to peaceful trade relationships to romance and intermarriage between groups. Denisovans were out there too, spread across Asia from Siberia to Southeast Asia. Modern humans encountered them in multiple locations over thousands of years. Like Neanderthals, Denisovans also interbred with modern humans. Their genetic legacy survives in modern Asian, Australian, and Pacific Island populations. Some of those inherited genes turned out to be incredibly valuable, providing adaptations to high altitude, resistance to certain diseases, and other survival advantages that still help people today. As modern humans continued spreading, they encountered astonishing environmental variety. Groups moving north into Central Asia faced vast grasslands called steppes, endless rolling plains where survival depended on following migrating herds of horses, bison, and mammoths. The climate was brutal, with harsh winters and brief, intense summers, but the hunting was spectacular if you had the skills to exploit it. Other groups moved east into what is now China and Southeast Asia. These regions offered completely different challenges and opportunities. Dense forests full of unfamiliar plants and animals, river systems prone to flooding, tropical diseases that had never existed in Africa, monsoon climates with extreme wet and dry seasons. The groups that succeeded in these environments had to develop entirely new survival strategies. Still others moved north into Europe, entering territories dominated by Neanderthals who had been there for hundreds of thousands of years. These encounters seem to have been particularly significant. The archaeological record shows that modern humans and Neanderthals lived in close proximity in places like the Middle East and Southern Europe for thousands of years. They used similar tools, hunted similar prey, even seemed to share some cultural practices, but something about modern humans gave them an edge. Maybe it was slightly superior communication abilities. Maybe it was more flexible social structures that allowed larger groups to cooperate. Maybe it was just luck, being in the right places when climate conditions shifted. Whatever the reason, modern humans gradually expanded while Neanderthals contracted. By about 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals had vanished from most of their former range, holding out in a few refugees in Spain and the Balkans before disappearing completely around 30,000 years ago. The pace of migration was breathtaking in evolutionary terms, but glacially slow in human terms. It took thousands of years for modern humans to spread from Africa to Australia, thousands more to fully reach Europe, many more thousands to cross into the Americas. Individual people didn't travel these entire distances. It was a multi-generational relay race, with each generation moving slightly further into new territories, establishing new settlements that became launching points for the next wave of explorers. And with each new environment, natural selection was at work. The humans who left Africa carried with them the same dark skin that had protected their ancestors from intense tropical sunlight for hundreds of thousands of years. That skin color was perfect for Africa. It was about to become a serious problem. Because the further north these migrants traveled, the less sunlight they received, and the less sunlight they received, the harder it became for their dark skin to produce enough vitamin D. This was setting up a biological crisis that would fundamentally change what humans looked like. Your ancestors made it north, out of Africa, across the Middle East, eventually into Europe and Central Asia. They were carrying the same dark skin that had protected their African ancestors for hundreds of thousands of years. Beautiful, melanin-rich skin, perfectly adapted for life under the African sun. And that skin was about to become potentially lethal. Here's what nobody tells you about human migration. It's not just about finding new territory and figuring out how to hunt different animals. It's about your body suddenly existing in an environment it was never designed for. For dark-skinned humans moving into northern latitudes, the most critical challenge wasn't the cold. It wasn't the different food sources. It wasn't even the Ice Age megafauna. It was something far more invisible, far more insidious: sunlight, or rather, the lack of it. Let's discuss vitamin D. And before your attention drifts, because this sounds like a supplement advertisement, understand this: vitamin D isn't really a vitamin at all. It's a hormone, a crucial hormone that your body manufactures when ultraviolet B rays from the sun strike your skin. Without it, you don't just feel slightly tired or get sick more frequently. Without it, your body fundamentally stops functioning properly. Vitamin D regulates calcium absorption. Without adequate vitamin D, your body can't extract calcium from your food into your bloodstream. And without calcium, your bones don't mineralize properly. They remain soft, weak, prone to deformity and fracture. In children, this causes a disease called rickets: legs that bow outward under the weight of the growing body, ribs that develop abnormal bumps and depressions, skulls that soften and deform, spines that curve and compress. In adults, the condition is called Osteomalacia. Your existing bones start losing their mineral content, becoming progressively weaker even without obvious injury. Fractures occur from normal activities. Bones ache constantly. Muscles weaken because calcium is also essential for muscle contraction, but it gets worse, much worse. Vitamin D is critical for immune function. Without it, your body's ability to fight infections plummets. People with severe deficiency get sick constantly, and they don't recover properly. Wounds don't heal. Respiratory infections that would be minor annoyances become life-threatening illnesses. In the dangerous, disease-ridden environments of prehistoric Europe and Asia, this alone would have been devastating. The hormone also regulates cell growth and helps prevent runaway cellular proliferation. People with chronic vitamin D deficiency show increased rates of various cancers. Their cardiovascular systems don't function optimally. Their brains don't produce neurotransmitters efficiently, leading to depression, cognitive impairment, and developmental delays in children. But the absolute worst effect, the one that made vitamin D deficiency a direct evolutionary crisis, was what it did to women's ability to give birth. Picture this. You're a young woman living in what is now Germany, perhaps 40,000 years ago. You've survived childhood, which was no small achievement. You've learned to hunt and gather in this cold, seasonal environment. You've found a mate, and now you're pregnant with your first child. You should feel optimistic. Your band has food stored for winter. The cave you're sheltering in is secure. Everything seems prepared for success. But you grew up with insufficient sunlight exposure. Your dark skin, perfect for Africa, blocked most of the weak UV rays that penetrated the clouds and reached you during the brief northern summers. Year after year, your body struggled to produce enough vitamin D. Year after year, your bones didn't mineralize quite correctly. The effects were subtle at first. Maybe you were slightly shorter than you should have been. Maybe you got sick more often. Maybe you felt tired frequently, but you survived. You adapted. You thought you were fine. Then you go into labor, and your pelvis, which developed without adequate vitamin D during your childhood and adolescence, isn't shaped correctly. Rickets had deformed it just enough. The birth canal is too narrow, the bones positioned at slightly wrong angles. The baby can't pass through. In the modern world, this means a cesarean section. In prehistoric Europe, this meant death. Both mother and child gone, all because of sunlight and melanin and a tragic mismatch between the two. This wasn't rare. This wasn't an occasional tragedy. Archaeological evidence from early northern populations shows high rates of pelvic deformities consistent with childhood rickets. Skeletal remains display the telltale signs: bowed legs, deformed ribs, bone abnormalities that would have made childbirth extraordinarily dangerous. Here's what makes this absolutely brutal. The women who died this way were the healthy ones. They were the ones who survived childhood, who reached reproductive age, who found mates and successfully conceived. They did everything right. And then their skeleton, shaped by years of vitamin D deficiency, killed them during the most fundamental biological process of all. The mathematics was devastating. If even a fraction of women in each generation died this way, and if the survivors had fewer children because of poor health, weakened immune systems, and repeated infections, the population couldn't sustain itself. Bands would shrink. Genetic diversity would decline. Within a few thousand years, dark-skinned humans in northern latitudes would simply go extinct, and yet, obviously, they didn't go extinct. You're alive right now, possibly with pale or light brown skin, that tells the story of how your ancestors solved this crisis. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, understand just how severe the vitamin D problem was in northern latitudes. In equatorial Africa, the sun sits directly overhead year-round. UV radiation was intense and constant. Even very dark skin loaded with melanin that blocks most UV rays still allows sufficient penetration to produce adequate vitamin D. Your African ancestors could manufacture all the vitamin D they needed with just a few minutes of sun exposure daily. Move to Northern Europe, and the physics changes completely. The sun never gets directly overhead. Its rays travel through far more atmosphere before reaching the ground, filtering out most of the UVB radiation needed for vitamin D synthesis. During winter, which can last 6 months or more at high latitudes, the sun angle is so low that virtually no vitamin D production occurs regardless of skin color. Even in summer, the sun is weak and often hidden behind clouds for days or weeks at a time. Do the calculation. Dark skin evolved to block about 90% of UV radiation. This is perfect in Africa, where UV levels are high enough that the remaining 10% is still plenty for vitamin D production. Move to Northern Europe, where UV levels might be only 10% of what they are in Africa. And now your dark skin is letting through maybe 1% of the original African level. It's not enough, not even close. Archaeological evidence shows this crisis playing out in real time. Early modern human remains from northern regions show widespread vitamin D deficiency markers. Bone analyses reveal the chemical signatures of inadequate mineralization. Skeletal deformities consistent with childhood rickets appear in the fossil record as humans spread north. Genetic evidence tells the same story. When scientists analyze ancient DNA from the earliest Europeans, they find something remarkable. Those people, the ones who first settled Europe between 40,000 and 10,000 years ago, they still had the genes for dark skin. They hadn't yet evolved the mutations for lighter pigmentation that would eventually dominate European populations. They were trying to survive with African skin in European conditions, and they were paying a terrible price. Some groups probably tried behavioral adaptations. Maybe they spent more time outdoors despite the cold, maximizing whatever sun exposure they could get. Maybe they removed more clothing during summer, exposing as much skin as possible to the weak sunshine. Maybe they preferentially settled in areas with more reliable sunny weather. But behavior can only compensate so much. You can't will your body to produce vitamin D from insufficient UV radiation. You can't think your way into stronger bones or a properly shaped pelvis. The laws of biochemistry and physics don't care about cultural adaptations. This was a crisis that required a biological solution. The human body needed to change, needed to become more efficient at capturing the scarce UV radiation available at northern latitudes. Natural selection needed to favor individuals whose skin was just slightly lighter, just slightly more transparent to UV rays. And that selection pressure needed to be powerful enough to overcome the massive disadvantage lighter skin would have in high UV environments, strong enough to spread new mutations through the population within just a few thousand years. It needed to be quite literally a matter of life and death. And it was. Women with slightly lighter skin could produce more vitamin D. Their bones developed more normally. Their pelvises formed properly. They could survive childbirth and raise children, while their darker-skinned counterparts died in labor or struggled with chronic illness and repeated miscarriages. The selection pressure was enormous, probably stronger than almost any other force acting on human populations at the time. And when natural selection pushes that hard, evolution responds fast. The stage was set for one of the most rapid evolutionary transformations in human history. Now, here's where the story gets molecular, where evolutionary pressure meets random chance and changes the appearance of entire populations forever. Your ancestors are living in Northern Europe and Northern Asia. They've been there for thousands of years, struggling with the vitamin D crisis, losing children to rickets and birth complications. Natural selection is screaming for a solution, but evolution doesn't plan. It doesn't design. It just waits for random mutations and then decides which ones survive. And then in some individual whose name we'll never know, in some band whose location we can only guess at, a copying error occurred. Deep in the genetic code, in a gene called SLC24A5, a single letter changed, one nucleotide out of 3 billion, the molecular equivalent of a typo in an encyclopedia. This gene codes for a protein involved in melanin production, the pigment that makes skin dark. And this one tiny change, this single letter substitution, reduced melanin production by approximately 30 to 40%. The person born with this mutation would have been noticeably lighter than their parents, not white like modern Northern Europeans, but distinctly paler, different enough to be remarkable in a population where everyone else was dark brown or black. In most places, at most times in human history, this mutation would have meant nothing. Maybe a slight disadvantage, actually, since lighter skin is more vulnerable to sun damage. The individual might have passed it to a few descendants, and then it would have disappeared, diluted back into the gene pool. But remember where we are: northern latitudes, low UV radiation, population suffering from chronic vitamin D deficiency. And here comes an individual whose lighter skin allows their body to synthesize vitamin D more efficiently than anyone around them. They were healthier. Their bones were stronger. If they were female, they had easier pregnancies and healthier babies. If they were male, they were more vigorous, more likely to survive winters, more attractive to potential mates. They had more children. And crucially, those children inherited the mutation and had the same advantages. Within a few dozen generations, maybe 1,000 years, this single mutation had spread through the entire population. Not because anyone decided lighter skin was superior, not because of culture or preference or conscious choice, but simply because individuals carrying this mutation were slightly more likely to survive and reproduce than those who didn't. This is natural selection at its purest, a random genetic change meeting an environmental pressure and spreading through a population because it solves a survival problem. But SLC24A5 wasn't working alone. It was just the beginning. Around the same time, or perhaps a few thousand years later, other mutations were appearing in other genes. SLC45. A2, another gene involved in melanin production, underwent its own random change. This mutation further reduced pigmentation, particularly affecting skin and hair color. Individuals carrying both the SLC24A5 and SLC45A2 mutations were even lighter than those with just one. Then came changes to TRP1, a gene that affects the type of melanin produced, and OCA2, which not only influences skin color but also eye color, which is why these traits often change together in populations. Each mutation by itself had a relatively modest effect, but together they were transformative. A person carrying mutations in all 4 of these genes could be dramatically lighter than their ancestors just a few thousand years earlier. And here's what's truly remarkable. These mutations didn't all happen in the same place or at the same time. The genetic archaeology shows us that different populations developed lighter skin through completely different genetic pathways. The mutation in SLC24A5 that's common in Europeans is almost completely absent in East Asian populations. But East Asians also have light skin. They got there through different mutations in different genes, particularly in OCA2, and other pigmentation genes we're still identifying. This is convergent evolution, 2 separate populations facing similar environmental pressures, evolving similar solutions through completely different genetic changes. It's like 2 engineers solving the same problem with different tools. The result looks similar, but the mechanism is entirely different. This tells us something profound. The shift to lighter skin in northern populations happened independently, multiple times, in multiple places. It wasn't a single event that spread around the world. It was a universal response to the same environmental pressure. Evolution finding the same solution again and again because it worked. Now let's talk about timescales, because this is where the story gets really interesting. These mutations are recent, shockingly recent in evolutionary terms. The SLC24A5 mutation that's nearly universal in modern Europeans show signs of positive selection starting only about 10,000 to 20,000 years ago. Some estimates place it even more recently, perhaps as little as 6,000 to 8,000 years ago. Think about what this means. 20,000 years ago, even the populations living in Northern Europe probably still had relatively dark skin. Not as dark as equatorial Africans, perhaps, but much darker than modern Europeans. The pale skin we associate with Northern Europeans today is a very recent innovation, newer than pottery, newer than agriculture in many regions, newer than most major human migrations. We have physical evidence supporting this timeline. The oldest intact European genome we've sequenced from a man who lived in Spain about 7,000 years ago shows he had dark skin and blue eyes. A combination that seems strange to us today, but was probably common among pre-agricultural Europeans. He carried the genes for blue eyes, which had evolved earlier, but not yet the mutations for pale skin. This means skin color changed faster than almost any other human trait we can measure. Within just a few hundred generations, populations went from dark brown to pale. That's evolutionary lightning speed. Why so fast? Because the selection pressure was intense. In northern latitudes with limited sunlight, the vitamin D crisis wasn't just making life uncomfortable. It was killing people, specifically killing pregnant women and young children at rates high enough to create massive evolutionary pressure. Any mutation that improved vitamin D synthesis, even slightly, provided enormous survival advantages. Individuals carrying these mutations might have had 10%, 20%, maybe 30% higher reproductive success than those without them. Over just 100 generations, that kind of selection pressure can completely transform a population's appearance. But here's what really matters, what you need to understand as you drift towards sleep tonight. These changes involved a tiny number of genes. Current. Research suggests that the vast majority of skin color variation in modern humans is controlled by somewhere between 15 and 30 genes. Probably fewer than 20 account for most of the visible differences. Out of approximately 20,000 genes in the human genome, maybe 20 control skin color. That's 0.1%. 1/10 of 1% of your genetic code determines whether you have dark skin or light skin. Put another way, a person with very dark skin and a person with very pale skin are genetically identical at 99.9% of their genes. The visible difference that seems so significant, that has caused so much social division and conflict throughout history, is the result of tiny tweaks to a microscopic fraction of the human genome. These are superficial adaptations, literally superficial, affecting only the surface of the body. They're no different in principle from the genes that determine whether you have attached or detached earlobes, whether you can roll your tongue, whether you have wet or dry earwax. Just minor variations in a species that is fundamentally, genetically, almost completely identical across all populations. The mutations that changed skin color didn't affect intelligence, personality, or capability. They couldn't have. Those traits are controlled by thousands of genes working in complex networks. You can't change them with a handful of mutations affecting pigment production in skin cells. What changed was melanin production, nothing more. A simple biochemical adjustment to a single physiological system made necessary by changes in UV radiation exposure. An evolutionary adaptation as straightforward and uncomplicated as developing darker fur in forest animals or lighter feathers in Arctic birds. But unlike those animals, humans built entire social hierarchies around these superficial variations. We created categories, invented meanings, constructed elaborate mythologies to explain differences that were actually just simple adaptations to sunlight levels. We turned a minor biochemical adjustment into something we imagined was profound and fundamental. The genetics tells a different story. It says these changes were recent, superficial, and evolved independently in multiple populations through different mutations. It says skin color is one of the least important ways that humans vary. It says we've been fighting for thousands of years over something that matters, genetically speaking, about as much as eye color or hair texture. As those mutations spread through northern populations, they were simply solving a problem, making it possible for humans to survive and thrive in low-light environments where their ancestors' darker skin had become a liability, nothing more, nothing less. But the story wasn't quite finished, because something else was about to happen that would accelerate these changes even faster, spreading pale skin across northern populations in just a few thousand years. Something that would transform human society and, unexpectedly, human appearance along with it. The agricultural revolution was coming, and it was about to change everything, including the color of human skin. Around 10,000 years ago, in a handful of locations scattered across the globe, people made a decision that would transform our species forever. They stopped hunting and gathering. They started farming. Now, this sounds like progress, right? The agricultural revolution, civilization, cities, writing, everything we associate with human advancement came from this moment. And it's true. Agriculture allowed human populations to explode. It created food surpluses that supported specialists, artisans, priests, warriors, eventually scientists and philosophers. It was the foundation of everything we call civilization. But in the short term, for the people who actually lived through the transition, farming was a nutritional disaster. Archaeological evidence shows that the first agricultural populations were shorter, sicker, and died younger than their hunter-gatherer ancestors. Their bones show signs of malnutrition. Their teeth reveal vitamin deficiencies. They suffered from diseases that had been rare or non-existent in hunter-gatherer societies. Why? Because early agriculture was essentially a nutritional catastrophe. Hunter-gatherers ate incredibly diverse diets. Depending on the season and location, they might consume dozens of different plant species, multiple types of game, fish, shellfish, insects, eggs, honey. This diversity meant they naturally obtained a wide range of nutrients. They were constantly moving, constantly encountering new food sources, constantly maintaining balanced nutrition without even trying. Most importantly for our story, hunter-gatherers in northern latitudes had reliable sources of vitamin D in their diets. Fish, especially fatty fish like salmon and mackerel, are packed with vitamin D. So are fish eggs and fish liver. Seal meat and seal oil, staples for Arctic populations, contain massive amounts of vitamin D. Land animal livers, particularly from game like elk and reindeer, provide substantial amounts too. Even bird eggs contain decent quantities. Hunter-gatherers in places like Scandinavia could survive with relatively dark skin because they were eating vitamin D. Yes, they'd have seasonal deficiencies during long, dark winters. Yes, lighter skin would have helped. But they weren't in crisis. They could get by. Their children might not have optimal bone development, but they'd survive. Then came farming. And suddenly, this dietary safety net vanished. The first agricultural populations didn't farm everything. They couldn't. Agriculture emerged independently in different regions, and in each place people domesticated whatever plants grew best in their local environment. In the Middle East, it was wheat and barley. In China, rice and millet. In Mesoamerica, corn and beans. In Africa, sorghum and yams. But here's what's crucial. None of these staple crops contain meaningful amounts of vitamin D. Plants don't make vitamin D, only animals do, and even then, only certain tissues. When you base your entire diet on cultivated grains and vegetables, you're essentially cutting yourself off from dietary vitamin D entirely. The early farmers of the Middle East weren't too severely affected because they were still living in relatively sunny regions. But when agriculture spread north into Europe, carried by migrating farming populations, the vitamin D crisis became acute. Imagine this. You're living in what's now Germany or Poland. It's 8,000 years ago. Your ancestors just arrived from the south bringing domesticated wheat and barley. For the first time in human history, you can stay in one place year-round. You clear forests, plant fields, build permanent settlements, but your diet has gone from varied with fish, game, wild plants, and seasonal diversity to monotonous, bread, porridge, maybe some vegetables if you're lucky, a bit of meat on special occasions, but nothing like the amounts hunter-gatherers consumed, and crucially, almost no fish. Agricultural populations settled inland, away from coasts and rivers, because that's where the best farming land was. Within a generation or two, the children are suffering. Rickets becomes epidemic. You're watching kids grow up with bent legs, deformed spines, weakened bones that fracture easily. Mothers are dying in childbirth because their pelvises never developed properly. Infants are dying from seizures caused by calcium deficiency. And remember, you're living at 50 degrees north latitude. In winter, the sun barely gets above the horizon. Even when it's out, it's too weak to trigger vitamin D synthesis in dark. Skin. You might get adequate sun exposure for 3 or 4 months per year. That's it. Under these conditions, the selective pressure for lighter skin didn't just increase, it exploded. This wasn't gradual anymore. This was a crisis happening in real time. Women with slightly lighter skin could synthesize vitamin D more efficiently. Their children had stronger bones. Their daughters survived childbirth more often. Their grandchildren were more numerous. The genetic evidence shows exactly what you'd expect from this kind of intense natural selection. The genes associated with light skin in Europeans, particularly the variants in SLC24A5 and SLC45A2, show what geneticists call signatures of recent positive selection. These are genes that swept through European populations incredibly quickly, far faster than random genetic drift would predict. We can actually calculate how fast. Based on the prevalence of these variants in modern populations and the rate of genetic change, researchers estimate that light-skinned genes went from rare to nearly universal in European farming populations in just 3,000 to 5,000 years. That's maybe 150 to 250 generations. In evolutionary terms, that's not change. That's transformation. And here's what makes this story even more fascinating. We know this happened because we can compare the genomes of ancient Europeans from different time periods. Thanks to improvements in ancient DNA extraction, researchers have sequenced DNA from European skeletons ranging from 40,000 years ago to just a few centuries ago. And what they found was stunning. European hunter-gatherers, the people who lived in Europe before agriculture arrived, were dark-skinned, not African dark necessarily, but significantly darker than modern Europeans. A famous example is Cheddar Man, a hunter-gatherer who lived in Britain about 10,000 years ago. Genetic analysis of his remarkably well-preserved remains shows he had dark skin, dark hair, and blue eyes. That combination looks unusual to us now, but it was probably common among pre-agricultural Europeans. These people had been living in Europe for thousands of years. Some of their ancestors had been there since the initial human migrations 40,000 years ago. They'd had plenty of time to evolve lighter skin if there was strong selective pressure for it. But they hadn't, because they didn't need to. Their fish-rich diets provided adequate vitamin D. Then farming arrived, brought by migrating populations from the Middle East. These early farmers were already somewhat lighter-skinned than Africans, having lived in the Middle East for thousands of years. But they weren't as light as modern Europeans either. The really dramatic skin lightening happened after they reached northern Europe, and their vitamin D-rich foods disappeared from their diets. The genetic evidence shows that modern Europeans are a mixture of 3 ancestral populations. the original dark-skinned hunter-gatherers, the early Ur farmers from the Middle East, and later Bronze Age migrants from the steppes. But the light-skinned genes swept through all three groups once they were living on grain-based diets in northern latitudes. It didn't matter what your ancestral population was. If you were farming in Scandinavia, your descendants needed light skin to survive. This created a kind of evolutionary feedback loop. Lighter skin meant healthier children. Healthier children meant larger families. Larger families meant agricultural villages could grow and expand. Successful farming communities could support more people, which meant more opportunities for light-skinned genes to spread through reproduction and marriage. Within just a few thousand years, the genetic landscape of Europe had been completely transformed. The same thing was happening in northern Asia, though through different genetic pathways. Agricultural populations in China, Korea, and Japan developed their own light-skin variants, mutations in different genes that achieved similar results. The speed of this change tells us something profound about human evolution. When selective pressure is strong enough, when survival is literally on the line, populations can change with stunning rapidity. The mutations were already there, rare variants floating around in the population. Agriculture didn't create them. It just made them desperately necessary, and the people living through this transformation had no idea what was happening. They didn't understand genetics or vitamin D or natural selection. They just knew that some families seemed healthier than others, that some women's children survived while others didn't, that over generations people were gradually, mysteriously becoming paler, but they could see the results. Within a few thousand years, the northern populations had shifted from predominantly dark to predominantly light. The mutations that had been slowly spreading through hunter-gatherers became survival necessities for farmers. And agriculture kept spreading, carrying light-skinned genes further north and east, with each generation of wheat and barley farmers pushing into new territories. This is why skin color changed so much faster than we'd expect from sun exposure alone. It wasn't just about adapting to less sunlight. It was about adapting to less sunlight while eating a diet that contained almost no vitamin D. Agriculture didn't just change where humans lived. It changed what humans ate. And that dietary change created selective pressures more intense than anything climate alone could produce. The people who survived were the ones whose genes allowed them to synthesize vitamin D from the weak northern sun. The ones who could feed their children on grain and still build strong bones. The ones who could farm in forests and survive. They became us, pale-skinned farmers spreading across the north, transforming the genetic landscape of entire continents in just a few thousand years, all because someone decided that planting seeds was easier than hunting deer. So after all of this, after bottlenecks and migrations, ice ages and sunshine, genes switching on and off like tiny molecular light dimmers, what does skin color actually mean? Biologically, it means one thing. It tells you how much ultraviolet radiation your ancestors' skin had to manage. That's it. Not how intelligent they were, not how kind or brave or creative, just how much sun their bodies had to solve a very specific problem for. If your ancestors lived for tens of thousands of years under brutal equatorial sunlight, they needed heavy-duty protection. Dark skin loaded with melanin acted like natural sunscreen. It shielded folate in the blood, protected DNA, reduced the risk of skin cancer, and kept developing embryos safe. If your ancestors wandered into places where the sun barely dragged itself above the horizon in winter, they faced a different danger. Not too much UV, but too little. They needed to squeeze every last photon of sunlight into vitamin D production, lighter. Skin was like opening the blinds wider. Less melanin meant more UV getting in, faster vitamin D production, stronger bones, healthier pregnancies. So when you look at someone's skin, what you're really seeing is a climate report, a UV history, a record of how much sunlight their lineage has negotiated with over the last 40,000, maybe 50,000 years. In evolutionary terms, that's yesterday. For most of our existence, every human walking the earth had dark skin, deep brown, rich in melanin, tuned for the high UV world of Africa where our story began. The first people who looked anything like white Europeans are a recent twist, the result of a few mutations that spread rapidly when our ancestors started farming in cloudy northern skies. Even ancient hunter-gatherers living in Ice Age Europe, many of them likely had dark skin and light eyes, or some other combination that doesn't fit our modern boxes. The sharp color boundaries we imagine today didn't exist. They're new. They're fragile. They're still changing, but our brains love boxes. They love categories. So we invented one: race. We told ourselves that skin color, hair texture, facial features all lined up neatly into a handful of discrete types. We gave those types names. We attached stories to them, stories about ability, about worth, about who belonged and who didn't. The trouble is, biology didn't cooperate. When geneticists look at humans, they don't see crisp lines. They see gradients, blends, smooth transitions across continents, like colors bleeding into each other on a watercolor map. Walk from the equator to the Arctic, step by step, village by village, and what you see isn't a set of sudden jumps from race to race. You see a slow shift in skin tone, facial features, body proportions, hair types, all adjusting to local climates, diets, and histories. A continuous fabric, not a quilt of separate pieces. There is variation, of course, real, visible, measurable variation. But when you zoom in at the level of DNA, that variation behaves very differently from the way our social labels suggest. Two people from the same race can be more genetically different from each other than either of them is from someone in a different race. Most of the genetic diversity in our species, around 85 to 90% of it, exists within local populations, not between them. What we call race captures a thin slice of surface traits, mostly tied to climate adaptation, and then inflates their meaning until they feel like destiny. Underneath all those surface differences, the numbers tell a very quiet, very simple story. All humans share about 99.9% of their DNA. That tiny 0.1% accounts for everything we can see: tall or short, curly hair or straight, dark skin or pale, green eyes or brown. All the visible diversity of 8 billion people squeezed into a fraction of a fraction. And even inside that 0.1%, almost none of it sorts neatly into our racial categories. Your skin color might line up with one group on a census form. Your lactose tolerance might line up with another. Your immune genes, your smell receptors, your ability to handle high altitude or digest certain plants, those might trace to ancestors scattered across continents you've never seen. Your body is a mosaic, assembled from thousands of ancient experiments, hundreds of migrations, dozens of small survival stories. None of that complexity fits inside a simple label. Race, as we usually talk about it, is not a biological fact. It's a social invention built on top of a few real biological trends. There are patterns, yes. People whose ancestors lived in West Africa tend to cluster genetically more closely with each other than with people from East Asia. People from Northern Europe tend to share more recent ancestors with each other than with people from the Pacific Islands. But if you try to draw hard boundaries, evolution laughs at you. Where exactly does Europe end and Asia begin in DNA? There is no single answer. The borders wobble, blur, dissolve under scrutiny. Every line you draw is part science, part politics, part history. The truth is gentler and stranger. We are one continuous family that never really stopped moving. Those early dark-skinned humans who stepped out of Africa around 60,000 years ago, they are the ancestors of everyone currently called white, black, Asian, Latino, Pacific Islander, and every other label we've created. There is no branch of humanity that did not pass through that African bottleneck. There is no pure group that stands apart. We are all remixed versions of the same ancient survival track. The genes that made some of us pale are teenagers in evolutionary time. Skin-lightening mutations common in Europe are maybe 6,000 to 10,000 years old. Some in East Asia are different mutations altogether, arriving independently, separate solutions to the same dim sun problem. Think about that for a moment. A person with very light skin in Sweden and a person with very light skin in northern China became pale for different genetic reasons at different times in different places. Yet, if you put them side by side, a casual observer might say, same race. Meanwhile, two people with very dark skin from distant parts of the tropics might be more genetically different from each other than either is from one of those pale-skinned strangers. Our social categories are trying to map a three-dimensional, swirling, overlapping storm of ancestry onto a flat little chart. No wonder they keep tearing at the edges. But instead of feeling lost in that complexity, you can let it calm you. Because once you understand what skin color really is, a local tweak for UV radiation, nothing more, you're free to see something deeper. You can see that the full range of human color, from the deepest ebony to the palest ivory, is not a hierarchy. It's a weather report, a record of sunlight and seasons, an atlas of where your ancestors stood under the sky, and how their bodies learned to make peace with the light. You can see that the curve of a nose, the shape of an eye, the thickness of a lip are not badges of superiority or inferiority. They're quiet archives of climate, diet, and chance. Adaptive footnotes in a story that has always been about staying alive just long enough to have children who could do the same. When you look around at humanity, the freckles and albinism, the golden brown, the red undertones, the olive shades, the near black that swallows light and throws it back as a soft sheen, you're really looking at evidence. Evidence that our species is astonishingly flexible, that we've walked through deserts and tundras, rainforests and high plateaus, and found a way to belong in each. Our diversity isn't a problem to be explained away. It's a map of where we've been. Each shade of skin is a postcard from a different latitude. Each facial feature is a rumor from a different climate. Each one whispers, someone like you survived here. And beneath all those variations, the similarities are overwhelming. The same 206 bones, the same 600-plus muscles, the same neural wiring that lights up when we hear a baby cry or a loved one laugh or a story that feels like it belongs to us. The same basic brain that learned to tame fire, to shape stone, to plant seeds, to build cities, to send robots to other planets and lullabies to other hearts. No matter how you look, your ancestors lived the same essential drama as everyone else's. They worried about food, they mourned their dead, they told stories around flames and under stars, they taught their children where the water was, where the danger was, where the hope was. Your skin is not a wall. It's a thin living border between your inner ocean of cells and the wider world. It's your first line of defense, your solar panel, your sensory blanket. And like everyone else's, it's built out of the same proteins, the same pigments, the same ancient instructions, copied and recopied through a chain of bodies stretching back nearly 1 million years. If you trace your lineage far enough, past nations, past empires, past languages, past even the first whisper of white or black as ideas, you end up in the same place as everyone else, on African soil under a hot sun, inside the skin of a small, dark-skinned population that had almost disappeared but didn't. Those people are your people. Their struggle is written in your cells. Their near extinction is the reason you exist at all, and everyone you've ever met carries that same inheritance. So as you lie here listening, letting the details blur, you can let your mind drift over the planet, over cities glowing softly in the dark, over villages tucked into valleys, over ships at sea and research stations in ice and tiny camps in deserts under a cold moon. Everywhere you look, people are sleeping or whispering or dreaming. Brown skin, black skin, pale skin, golden skin, all of it doing the same quiet work, repairing, rebuilding, preparing for another day under whatever sky they were born beneath. All of them cousins, not metaphorically, literally. The deep meaning of skin color is not that we are different species or different kinds of human. It's that we are one species, so adaptable, so inventive, so stubbornly alive that we've learned to turn sunlight itself into a sculpture of our appearance without ever changing what matters underneath. Bones, blood, stories, fear and courage, loss and love. These are the things that define us, and they do not care about melanin. So, when you think about skin color now, you can think of it as a soft overlay, a filter the Earth placed on us in different places for different reasons. Beautiful? Yes. Meaningful in a narrow biological sense? Yes. But not a measure of worth, not a boundary on who you're connected to. In the end, all those colors flow back into the same river of ancestry, the same shared origin, the same fragile, miraculous survival. And as you drift towards sleep, you can rest in that knowledge. You are part of one immense, intertwined human story. Your skin is just your chapter's cover art. The book beneath is the same one everyone else is carrying.